Hey, what a pretty flower. Hello, you beautiful people. Aaron here, back with another video. Say hello to NILOU, one of the new characters coming to Genshin in the 3.1 patch. Hello, NILOU. Welcome. How are you doing today, NILOU? Oh yeah, that's right. She's pixels and she can't speak or have feelings unless we force her to. Let me just try this.
I crave violence, father.
Oh, beautiful. Perfect. I'm so glad to hear that. Welcome to the Female Redheaded Eco-Radicalist Club, NILOU. So yes, NILOU is upon us. Did that sound threatening? Good. But before she comes out, I want to give you all the rundown of what she can and can't do. Is this a leak video? Perhaps. Anyways, I will not be talking about everything in her kit, so I will leave the information of her Honey Hunter page in the description below if you want to see. At the time of making this script, not all the numbers, specifically buffs, have been updated, so there will be some variation from the information compared to the one in this video. Those things are minor though, but I can give you a general idea of what she's like. NILOU is a Hydro stance switching main DPS and sub DPS unit, while also acting as a Bloom enabler and amplifier as well as Hydro applicator. Now before we talk more about NILOU, I just want to say if you like my content, please consider liking the video and subscribing. Okay, now let's get into it. So NILOU has two specific things that I definitely need to mention. The first is her tactical nukes, I mean bountiful cores. Bountiful cores. If you don't know, NILOU is a character that enables a new type of reaction to occur. This reaction replaces Bloom when there is at least one Hydro and Dendro character on the same team and no other elements. This reaction scales with the elemental mastery of the character that triggered the Bloom reaction as well as the max HP of NILOU. When the Bloom occurs, a bountiful core will drop instead of a Bloom seed, and this bountiful core has an inherent larger area of effect and explodes almost immediately upon creation. This reaction still deals damage to your own team though. Since they activate almost immediately, you can consider this reaction to be a pseudo Tartaglia, as it heavily benefits off of quadratic scaling. Next is her stance switching capabilities, which I should mention. This stance switch is on her elemental skill. After using the elemental skill, normal attacking will have her change into her main DPS stance for 8 seconds. While continuing to press her elemental skill, we'll have her switch to sub DPS mode. Each stance requires 3 attacks to occur before the stance is activated, and the main DPS 3 attacks deal more damage. However, the sub DPS form applies an AoE to the active character that applies wet to enemies. All the damage in these stances count as elemental skill damage. So that's the basics of bountiful cores and her stance switch. Now we can discuss what stats she needs. Well, obviously first is HP. Not only does NILOU's elemental skill and burst skill with HP, but so does the entire team's bountiful core damage. Obviously, this is crazy good. You want a good amount of HP to not only maximize her skill and bursts damage, but also the team's bountiful core damage. You should try and get it to be about 60,000 HP, but sometimes you just can't do that. So aim for above 50,000 HP instead. Then there's energy recharge. Her burst is at a high cost of 70 for energy requirement. However, she can reliably generate about 5 particles per elemental skill cast, which is quite a lot. You can easily generate half of her burst with about 200% energy recharge. However, Dendro characters are usually going to run Favonius weapons, and just using one to funnel NILOU would lower the requirement to about 166.7% energy recharge. And there's crit rate and crit damage. With the amount of HP you want on NILOU, you don't really have much space for crit rate and crit damage. Due to her low elemental skill scaling and decent elemental burst scaling, but crazy good bountiful core scaling, sacrificing HP for crit rate and crit damage turns out to be a lower DPS output overall. So I would recommend going for 60% crit rate to 120% crit damage at most. In order from most to least important, I would suggest energy recharge up until 166.7%, then HP as high as possible, and finally a decent 1-to-2 crit ratio. But whoa, wait. What about elemental mastery? Why is that not incorporated? Well, the thing about elemental mastery is that it's not that good for NILOU. As I said before, bountiful core's damage is reliant on NILOU's max HP and the EM of the character who procs the reaction. So the main question is, who's procking the bountiful cores? Well, first we'd have to set up a team. We'll have NILOU and Pole plus Dendro Traveler, and the last slot is open for specifically a healer. This is mainly because you're slowly killing your team due to how bountiful cores also hit you, so you gotta sustain them through it. In this situation, the two choices are Kokomi and Barbara. These two characters work differently and lead to two separate answers. Since Kokomi is the best choice in this situation, let's start there. Kokomi's jellyfish is the main selling point and applies Hydro once every 2 seconds. Then there's NILOU, who has normal ICD on everything, meaning her skill will apply Hydro once every every 3 hits, or about 2 seconds. Her burst will proc it once per hit, or 2 times in 3 seconds, and the aura she summons applies Hydro once every 2.5 seconds. Now there's Kole, who will apply Dendro every hit of her skill and once every 2.5 seconds with her burst. And finally, it's Dendro Traveler, who has a normal ICD on their burst, which is once every 2 hits or once every 3 seconds. That being said, we can see that Hydro has the faster application here, which means it will overtake Dendro most of the time, and Dendro will be the one activating Bountiful Cores. But going a main DPS on NILOU changes this because NILOU's Hydro application will be mostly on a single target, so Kokomi will be the one competing with 2 Dendro sources in an area. This means that Kokomi and Dendro will be the ones activating the cores. If we take a look at Barbara, we can see a similar thing. With Barbara acting as a driver, the single target Hydro application will outpace the Dendro application in most situations, but then NILOU would be the only one applying Hydro to those in an AoE. This means that EM could be good here, but if you are doing this, you could just put an instructor's set on Barbara to buff the party instead. The other option is main DPS NILOU in this composition, where NILOU would be the only one really able to proc the reaction, in which case it would be better for reactionary damage. So in this situation, NILOU and Dendro would be the ones proccing the reaction. However, if you are going main DPS NILOU with a Barbara, then why not just build her with more crit rate since you're playing her as more of a main DPS. This will only be single target focused too, so the quadratic scaling from the Bountiful Cores won't matter as much, therefore lowering the need for Elemental Mastery even more. And yes, I have math to prove this too. As you might know, I like to make polls to see what 4-star weapons you all plan to use with NILOU, and the vote came out to an overwhelming majority of dang it. Though I will explain why in a second, but I'm not using this weapon. Instead, I'll use the second place, which was a 3-way tie. So I'm going to use Sapwood Blade since I feel like that's a decent free-to-play option. I also used her signature weapon. As you could see, the Bountiful Core damage increase for NILOU is on average about 8.3%, but the damage of Kokomi or Barbara and the Dendro characters' Bountiful Cores drop by an average of 6.3% and 5.3% respectively. All around, the damage loss of Bountiful Cores when not running HP on NILOU leads to an average team damage loss of 4% for Sapwood Blade and 1.4% for her signature weapon. But is there a time when running Elemental Mastery is better on average than running HP? Well, yes there is. The number is about 72,300 health. Yes, it's that high. Now that's a massive amount, and as such it can only realistically be obtained with her signature weapon, or with external HP buffing sources, so it's not really reasonable to aim for this. Because of these things, I have to say without a doubt in my mind that Elemental Mastery is not great for NILOU. It's not a bad option, but overall there are better things to invest into, and health will generally just be a direct upgrade most of the time. So now onto weapons. What works best with her? Well, I'm going to start with what doesn't, that being Elemental Mastery weapons. As stated before, Elemental Mastery is not as useful as HP would be to a team's overall damage output, but should you still run a weapon with it? Well, let's talk quick about the 4 Elemental Mastery wielding swords: the Iron Sting, Xiphos' Moonlight, the Alley Flash, and the Freedom Sworn. All of these weapons have Elemental Mastery substats with pretty strong passives, but as stated before, why would you want to use these weapons when you can just use a weapon that has a better stat? Like, why not just run the Sap Sword, which also grants a bit less Elemental Mastery but to any character of your choice, while also granting energy recharge to the wielder? Well, it would be their passives, which is where another issue lies with these weapons. Freedom Sworn would grant NILOU the Elemental Mastery and a 10% damage boost, but she doesn't benefit from the normal charged and plunging attack damage increase as well as the base attack or attack percent this weapon provides. Xiphos' Moonlight would turn Elemental Mastery into energy recharge for the whole team, which is incredible. However, it just got nerfed, and now would require an entire 917 Elemental Mastery for NILOU to have just 66% energy recharge, which is a stat that means more to her than Elemental Mastery. Then there's the Iron Sting, which actually has a pretty decently strong passive effect. The passive can supplement its downside of not granting a stat to increase her personal damage by granting a straight up percent damage buff. Then there's the Alley Flash, which is a mistake. Not only does it have about 100 EM less than other weapons, but it also has a high base attack, which she cannot use, and a percent damage increase in passive that goes away upon taking damage, which is always happening in a NILOU comp. The only thing you're getting from this weapon would be about 2 2/3 worth of elemental mastery substats for your artifacts. For all these reasons stated, I will not be including these weapons in my calculations, just because there are better options. Also, I will be making my builds with high investment that can be obtainable in-game. You can consider these builds to be a very good stopping point, and if you do get higher numbers, then you have yourself a really good NILOU. Alright, let's hop in. The numbers on screen now are specifically for NILOU's personal damage, including her Dendro party members' Bountiful Core damage. Her skill and burst will strike 3 enemies each, and her Bountiful Cores will hit about 144 times. That might seem like a lot, and it is, but the amount of procs that you'll get from this reaction, it is through the roof because of its uptime and its quadratic scaling. To be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if you get even more off of a single rotation. Obviously, the HP and crit weapons are at the top, as they dominate every other weapon available. Then we got Sacrificial Sword, because it allows NILOU to get off 2 skills, which means she can act as a main DPS and sub DPS in the same rotation. This weapon can also single-handedly fulfill all of NILOU's energy needs, as it can almost fill up her entire elemental burst. Then we got the Skyward Blade, who is decent, then the Favonius Sword, and finally Sapwood. The Sapwood Blade would be higher up, but I did not incorporate the damage increase it grants the extra character's elemental mastery. I would rate Sapwood and Favonius the same though, because one boosts team rotations while the other offers very versatile buffing. The issue I had with some of these builds is that the energy recharge ones tended to float more toward the 53,000 HP range, whereas the others were clearly above 55,000. So I decided to see what would happen if I took their crit circlet and put an HP circlet on those so they could reach that threshold. And well, as you could see, it buffed their overall damage by about 4.5%. That led me to thinking, what if I make her go only HP percent? So I tried that as well, and while it is a damage increase from the original HP Hydro crit build by about 2.5%, it is an overall damage decrease from the previous HP Hydro HP set by about 2.1%, which is bizarre. Through this, we can figure that her best artifact stats would be HP percent Hydro damage, then HP percent again. And yes, I did try HP crit, and it was only better than HP Hydro crit, but pales in comparison to the other two. So we know what she wants for main and substats on artifacts, but what artifact sets? Well, really just a 2-piece tenacity. That's really it. You could swap that with other 2 pieces, but it does not seem like she has a full artifact set as of yet. You could pair it with Heart of Depth for the Hydro damage like I did for the weapons above, or go for Elemental Mastery and Gilded Dreams, or Wanderers if you want to utilize her own Bountiful Cores. Then there's the 2-piece emblem if you're struggling with finding energy recharge, and finally Noblesse for the extra burst damage. Otherwise, nothing is clearly her best. You can consider going for a full Gilded Dream set, but NILOU will not be the one proccing the blooms most of the time, so it seems rather pointless, as is the attack percent she receives from the set. To end this video off, I want to talk more about team comps and her viability because they are directly linked. This would also technically be my pros and cons section. Everything's merged here. NILOU wants a double Hydro and double Dendro setup, not only because her passive incentivizes it, but also because the resonances increase the entire team's Bountiful Core damage through the HP percent it grants NILOU and the team-wide elemental mastery boost it grants too. There's also the fact that without 2 Hydro characters and 2 Dendro characters, the amount of Bountiful Core procs will go down tremendously, as there will only be one character proccing the reaction. So if you did want to take one out, the other character would have to be a very self-reliant hyper carry to do that. The fact that you also need to protect your team is another detriment because you can't use actual DPS characters in the comp without fear of blowing yourself up. You can try running Xingqiu, but his healing should not be enough to sustain the entire team. These reactions force you to run NILOU with Kokomi or Barbara, Dendro Traveler, and Kole or Kusanali when she's released. It's incredibly limiting and requires 3 5-star characters. The characters that you would pair her with are also a lot more versatile and are able to be played in many other compositions, whereas NILOU just cannot. The other downside is that Dendro doesn't have good units. Kole is not great and only has really good Dendro application at the start of rotations. Thankfully, Dendro Traveler can buff Elemental Mastery and Elemental Damage bonus, which helps a ton. There's also the fact that you can't run Animo for any elemental resistance shredding, and instead need to swipe for it with NILOU's second constellation, which is yet another issue. NILOU's constellations fix many problems with her forced playstyle, as they increase her consistency in personal damage, they reduce resistances of enemies by an absurd amount, they refund energy to herself, and they also grant her absurd crit value. Her constellations are all major buffs that seem to plan to fix the artificial issues that Hoyoverse decided to place into her kit. She definitely, at least right now, seems more like a whale character than someone with a budget would use. Lastly, she lacks a full artifact set at the moment, which hinders her especially. Her teams also do not have great artifact synergy, as they only work well with a Deepwood Memories set on Kokomi or one of your Dendro characters, Instructor set on Barbara, and Gilded Dreams for everyone else. Supposedly, she will get better over time, but the future is never certain. She is bad for the same reason that Kujosara, Yunjin, Goro, and Shenhe are all bad. If you do not have those two characters that they need to be paired with, or you just don't like them at all, they are useless to your account. But if you do, they are the best character you can ask for. The thing about NILOU though is that she requires much more than just one specific teammate and maybe an extra condition. NILOU requires many specific teammates in order to function appropriately, plus multiple conditions. The upside to this is that she offers some great damage if you can fulfill these multiple conditions, and if you can fulfill even more conditions, she can become an absolutely insane monster with absurdly high DPS while also being monstrously tanky. She also comes with the upside of being the only character with movable off-field persistent AoE Hydra application, so she could be a decent burst DPS freeze enabler with a full noblesse. So NILOU is a very strange character that can allow your party to deal insane damage. However, this is all at the cost of some very serious limitations that she falls under. She's specifically a Bloom specialist and nothing else. However, because we are guaranteed to get more Dendro characters in the near future, we are guaranteed to get more NILOU support later down the line. That being said, I cannot recommend NILOU to anyone unless you really like her and or you intend to whale for her. She will not be in the best state on launch, but will get more support and more versatility by the time of her first rerun. So maybe wait until then. But what do you guys think about NILOU? Do you agree or disagree? Do you plan to use her? If so, how? Tell me in the comments below. But with that, I'm off to start my Candace video. Thank you all for watching this one, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Bye bye!